A daughter of the diaspora, Arawak, West African, Indian, and Dutch, hailing from Trinidad and living between Toronto and New York, Katrin Milan has dedicated her work towards human rights, justice, and equity. In addition to being an award-winning and internationally acclaimed artist, Milan's work has been featured in the Huffington Post, Out Magazine, Feminist Wire, and NPR, as just a few examples. Kim is also the co-founder of the People Project, an organization that facilitates innovative arts and leadership opportunities for queer and trans youth of color and allies through alternative activism and art activism, as well as being a member of the Healing Initiatives, which include teaching queer and brown girls yoga. As a human rights educator, Milan has delivered hundreds of workshops surrounding the topics of race, gender, power, consent, food, privilege, creation, and entrepreneurship, and has made herself a resource by sharing her own stories and experiences. Michelle Yee once wrote in The Grid that Milan manages to explore her own ideas around intersecting identities and anti-oppressive politics in her work, which she uses as a tool to educate the public. In the following keynote lecture, Kim will share her digital practices as an educator, organizer, and artist. She will also address the strengths and opportunities and challenges embedded in digital forums and its relationship to issues of access and accessibility, critical consciousness raising, and grassroots mobilizing. Please welcome Katrin Milan.
Thank you so much for having me back a second time to your school. It always means a lot to me to get to be invited to any number of different spaces. Digital practices and intersectionality. So for me, it's really fundamentally starting from a place of recognizing that our liberation has to be intersectional, intergenerational, and queer and trans inclusive. And it was really in online spaces first that I began to see that level of inclusiveness. That so often I found that as a queer woman of color, that often when I was invited into activist spaces, it was as a Black woman or as a woman, but never in the full totality of all of my identities. And I am someone who is Black and mixed race, and I talk about this a lot. It's a very, very, very mixed background. My grandmother is Arawak, Venezuelan. My grandfather is Indian from India, and then on my father's side, my grandfather is Scottish, and my grandmother is Afro-Dominican from the island of Dominica. So I grew up listening to Spanish and Hindi. Intersectionality and diversity have always been an absolute natural and necessitative part of my life. And so often as a mixed race person, people will ask me to qualify the exact percentage of a thing I am. And I hate playing that game because it never goes anywhere positive. And so often now what I say, and this is also as a result of something I learned online from Yumi Tamsha, who's a friend, is that I am layers and not fractions. And for me, that's what embodying intersectionality is about. It's about recognizing that we are layers and not fractions, and we need to create spaces for people to come to the table as their whole selves, as opposed to asking people to fight in piecemeal. And for me, it's also about recognizing that it's not our differences that divide us, it's our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences. Again, so often what I kept finding in a lot of social justice spaces was this desire to create this monolithic Black experience or monolithic woman experience. It was really in online spaces I began to see the way that there's no normal. And as someone who's traveled a lot in my life, I think the one thing I would say is that in every part of the world, everyone's doing it really different. You know, Poland is not doing what Nicaragua is doing, is not doing what South Africa is doing, and it is so important that instead of forcing each other to be this sameness, that we actually make a lot of space for us to articulate our differences as often as possible. And for me, one other really primary part to the work that I do online has been about shifting this idea of mainstream culture. I've always really felt uncomfortable with that idea because just because something is corporately funded and dominates a particular kind of media does not mean that it's my mainstream. If I don't subscribe to it, then that's not my culture. And the culture that I'm practicing is not subculture or counterculture, it is my culture. I'm not doing this in response to someone else, but rather this is the community and the spaces that I have been raised in and the art and media that I like to engage in. And so I think that that's one of the other amazing things that can happen online is that we can start to see this shift from this idea of just calling mainstream culture a mainstream media and naming it more as corporate media, naming it as social media. And I think that that is really necessary in a lot of different ways. Similarly with education, I'm a proud university walkout, and I think that often we associate education with university or with institutions. And there's an assumption that there's no other way for us to learn outside of these walls. And I have been engaged in a dedicated practice of learning for over a decade that has not involved institutions. And so I really think that, and one of the primary spaces I have found that have really elevated that has been online, like Tumblr is bae. It is such an incredible place where there's so many incredible activists and artists and writers who are sharing a lot of this knowledge, and I think that it is really important that knowledge be more and more accessible, because then we are creating a different class of people who are speaking an entirely new language, who no longer can often communicate with the communities that we came from. We need to have that bridging, and we need to have all of us. I also think it's important to start off and say, that we are on Indigenous land. For me, where I work in Toronto a lot is the land of the Mississauga and the Huron. I think that often one of the things that we have happen to us because of the way that corporate media shares information, because of the way that a lot of education is generally shared, it really perpetuates this idea of a colonial narrative as being the beginning. Right? Like Canada and the United States is the beginning, and there was nothing else happening before that, and there's nothing else happening while that is happening. And so I think it is really important for us to think about what our solidarity looks like with Indigenous communities on this landmass, recognizing that we have a long history of working together that is often eclipsed because we are not getting to hear the stories from our own communities. Because in the process of nation states and making of people, we also unmake people, and the construction of people who do not have status. And especially in the United States and in Canada, migrant workers are producing most of the food and have no rights and protections. So often we can feel like we're independent, but our independence comes at the cost of so many people who become invisibilized for us to be visible. The people who come in at 2 a.m. to clean the buildings, the people who build these spaces, the people who grow our food. My grandmother was someone who cleaned after people for her whole life. It is because of her and because of her labor that I am possible. And we cannot continue to act as though these are things that are happening in a vacuum. Because in the way that we have undocumented folks in our borders, we also create the context of refugees all over the world. I often talk about this in terms of using the right words, that we talk about the global south as being underdeveloped, when in fact what we're actually knowing is that it is overexploited. And if we recognize there's overexploitation of land, of resources, of people, then we know that people are displaced in that process. And so we have a responsibility in this place, in the world, to make sure that we are really challenging the ideas that we're being told about each other. I think one of the most powerful things that happens on the internet is that we can learn about each other from each other. I remember my first year, actually, at university, and it was an anthropology class, and a really good friend of mine who was sitting beside me was Mayan, and my professor was talking about Mayan theology, and you know how people get really into this idea that the world was ending when they were talking about, and my friend is like, oh, this is so frustrating, everybody thinks this about my culture, but that's not accurate. And I was like, well, girl, you tell him. She puts up her hand and she explains, and she's like, a lot of people have this misinterpretation of the text, and it usually is based on their own interpretations that they're placing. And the professor responded, and he was like, well, this was my major or my thesis, and I studied this for 7 years. And she was like, that's cute, I've been Mayan my whole life. And for me, it was this moment, this light bulb moment, where I recognized that here I am privileging someone at the front of the room who has third, fourth, fifth-hand knowledge of us. While meanwhile, there are literally hundreds of people around me with first-hand knowledge of their own cultures and their own experiences. One of the things we're often taught in these spaces is that objectivity is more valuable than subjectivity. But objectivity is a figment of the colonizer's imagination. There is no such thing. We are all subjective. And that subjectivity is deeply valuable and can be deeply valuable in the ways that we work. And that is one of the ways I feel like internet spaces and digital spaces allow for that subjectivity to be more valuable than we have seen in the past. When we talk about the ways that these systems are kept in place, systems like racism and sexism, ableism, we're talking about privilege and power. And when I talk about privilege, I'm also talking about the privilege to remain exempt from perpetuating social inequity. And what that means is we're never going to hear about the white crime rate, or but we're never going to hear about the parenting styles of heterosexual parents. Like, that's not going to be called into question. It will always be the group that is named as the other, as the marginalized group. That's one of the experiences of privilege. And also it's about the power to define. And so often that power has been in the hands of a very, very, very small group of people. You know, the people who write the dictionaries, the people who make the maps. Maps themselves are something that are made with a political purpose, you know? Like, we are on a sphere in the middle of the universe. There's no up nor down. Like, north and south are political decisions, make no mistake about it. The way that we see the map and the fact that North America is always positioned as larger than everywhere else in the world is also not an accident. These things are deliberate to construct who's valuable and who is important, and then therefore at the same time to tell you who is not important. And the importance then of having the capacity to shift these kinds of systems of definition. You know, we often think that culture and language come from the top down, when in fact it comes from the bottom up. Like, it is our usage of language up against each other that creates terms that are substantially more valuable. That's why when you look up things like racism in the dictionary, the definition is irrelevant. It has absolutely no basis in reality because it is not created by someone who has any sort of real lived experience around that. And I think that also one of the things that the map ends up doing is creates this idea, and these languages creates this idea of who there is more of and who there is less of in the world, you know? And I hate the term minority because I'm not a minority. 7 out of 10, every 10 people in the world are people of color. I am the majority. I am so the majority. And I think that so much of that language of minority has more to do with the idea of classifying certain groups as minors, especially in the context of our governments that have historically defined Native people and Black people and people of color as less than a full person. The idea of suggesting that just because there is a few of a group of people that somehow means that the majority is allowed to erode someone's rights. Never allow yourself to think that majority rules is an effective way of executing justice. The majority can never make decisions for the minority, and we also have to ask questions about this idea of minority. What does this mean about the people who are incarcerated? People who get locked up? Are those people who are also being considered? What about the people who are migrant workers? You know, so often the ways that even these statistical analysis that we get are not inclusive because we're not actually hearing the target from where these things are coming from. And again, I love recess, y'all. Take these history books with a grain of salt as they focus primarily on white Western males. And I love how they just kind of like slid this into the show, and it was just like a regular day, and then all of a sudden you were just dropping all this knowledge. And again, something I found online in the way that this was constructed, but I think that, you know, this has a lot to do with the way that we understand the world. You know, I remember I studied history, I was in love with history, because I was really curious to understand how I came to be. How did all of these different people from different parts of the world come to be in Trinidad to make me, and how did I get here? And the more that I read, the more that I found that we weren't there. I was like, how often can I learn about the same 4 white guys everywhere in the world? You know, and I think this is a huge challenge because we don't need one narrative of truth. There are multiple realities happening at all time. And my reality doesn't invalidate yours, but it necessarily complicates it. And the problem with this constant, like, unilateral narrative is that we don't hear that complication, and that we assume these narratives are everything that was happening. And because of the people recording history tend to focus on war, that's often what we only talk about. And we believe that it is in our history to be naturally, like, constantly at war and in violent places with each other, when we have so many more examples of solidarity to pull from that we don't actually get to hear about. And today, much is the same. 3% of the decision-making in media comes from women. That means 97% of how women are portrayed is decided on by men. And this is not just for women, it's also for genderqueer people, it's also for trans folks. It means that a really small percentage of the population is getting to make decisions about how everyone else is represented and everyone else is reflected. And we know this, you know? It is so important in the ways that we're seeing now online that we're actually getting to see different cultural producers. You know, we're getting to see more and more people telling stories, and these things are distinctly important for having a more accurate representation of what's genuinely happening in the world. And with the rest, I love Audrey. I have like her tattooed on my body, like I have feelings about her. There's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives, and that is part, again, of the reason why we need to have these more nuanced reflections. There was recently a web series produced called Her Story by Angelica Ross, and she's one of the stars in it. And it is all produced by a trans women of color cast, and you can tell that from the content, you know? It's substantially funnier, it's way more nuanced, you know, it's way more interesting because the kind of jokes and knowledge that we have in our own communities is greater than people from outside. And that's why I want to hear individuals tell their different stories. And so, when we think about the way this plays out in terms of intersectionality, we recognize that the people who are most vulnerable and most marginalized sitting at a place of, an example, racism, ableism, heterosexism, and sexism, that these stories are the ones that tend to be prioritized the least. It's these narratives that are super valuable that we often do not get to hear from at all. And I think, again, this is one of the things that we start to see shifting on online spaces, you know? I think most physical spaces are really inaccessible for disabled and differently able people. And online is one of the few spaces where I get to build actively with a lot of my disabled peers, a lot of my deaf peers, because we can do that in these kinds of contexts. But again, because of the ways that the world has been constructed, we recognize that there is a problem in terms of who gets to be visible. And if we recognize that we are all interconnected and our actions and inactions impact each other powerfully, what we want to do is be conscious about the way those things happen. So often the ways that capitalism functions is that, you know, we feel very insulated in the spaces that we are in, and we don't recognize that each of the decisions that we're making are actively impacting other people. And often we end up blaming the people who are the least responsible for so many of the problems that we experience. If I had to dollar for every time a baby boomer complained about my generation, I'd have enough money to buy a house and a mortgage to get ruined. And it's satire, but I do think it's really important. As someone, I think I work a lot with young people and I work a lot with people of different ages also, but so often what I hear from adults is like how young people being on their cell phones is like ruining the world. And I'm like, I'm kind of sure that the problems that we have are because of grown-ups. I'm pretty sure that 14-year-olds are not in a position to really be causing this problem. And again, I think that what we see because of the way these systems work is that we're blaming again the people who are least responsible. This happens in our language. Terms like using the term like crazy or insane. You know, people who have mental illness are least likely to be committing acts of violence, and we are most likely to call them responsible in our language, as opposed to saying things like, no, this is the result of conscious, calculated greed, and not because you're stupid, right? And it's really important that we shift these kinds of ideas so that we're not continually blaming the most vulnerable people, and it's really this interruption that I see happening a lot online. And a recognition that younger and younger kids are having this conversation. Are you dolls having a party? No, Mom, they're revolting against an oppressive government that's trying to remove their civil rights. And I was this kid. I was 6 years old, and I just like didn't understand poverty. Like, you couldn't explain it to me, and I couldn't get why it was happening. And I kept asking this question, and constantly what I kept being met with was like, stop. Stop asking so many questions. I don't know the answer. I'm not sure. Things are just this way. And it is so deeply important that we allow this kind of work to happen in really, really young kids. And again, it's really in online spaces that I'm like connecting with like 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds whose discourse is like, there's an 11-year-old boy who I'm like building with right now who can quote Malcolm X in a way that I cannot even imagine or hope to in my lifetime, you know? And we want that, right? Like, we want younger and younger people to be more and more challenged by this system, to be shifting it. And I think we have a responsibility to make maps and not monuments. That often what we do is we erect these like statues about people in our past, and that is supposed to be valuable or a testament to what they did, as opposed to giving us maps of how we got to the place that we are in and how we can hopefully get out. I think this also happens, I'm going to kind of move through a few different spaces, but this also definitely happens with Indigenous folks in this country and the way that that story happens. I saw this and I thought it was just so great, also on Tumblr. I get that Native Americans are upset, I get it. That being said, this country would not be what it is today if the actions of our past were not taken. And we know that this is something that people are being taught, for example, like in their textbooks. But then the interruption, which is so great. They mean Native Americans should feel grateful that 90% of their population was exterminated because the remaining 10% get to live in poverty on reservations while everyone else gets to enjoy Starbucks and Amazon Prime and pretend our military isn't terrorizing the rest of the world so we can live in a protected bubble of ignorance.
Right.
I was like, Tumblr, ew. Because it is these kinds of interruptions that remind us of these ideas that we are told are unchanging, are changing, right? That we are in a constant place of flux. Just as colonization is an ongoing process, so is resistance and mobilization. And again, what we're not hearing are those stories of resistance and mobilization, and we continue to feel like colonization has just been winning. But we are absolutely the reason why things are even in the place of contention that exist right now. And again, there's so many Indigenous communities, we're talking about what's happening in Flint, Michigan, and it's terrible. We also know this is happening to Indigenous communities all over the country, and it's also happening to other Black communities, that people are literally having so much money pulled out from their communities while at the same time not having access to running water or like clean water. And again, we have a responsibility to engage in this level of accountability with each other, to ask these questions and to know these stories. Because we hear these ideas about who is actually in charge of this country, but we recognize on the ground who's really doing that labor work. And that is one of the beautiful things that happen on a medium that allows a little bit more of a democratization of the voice. And I think that so often, again, as Black folks and Indigenous folks, we have a really important coalition and work and building to be doing, and with folks of color. I think that so often, because we're responding to the monolith of racism, we don't get to talk to each other enough about what that would look like with each other. This is from a great article, and is linked at the bottom of the piece, and it kind of talks about the relationship between anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity, and why those things have kind of been pulled away from each other, and the ways that we can kind of think about what reconciliation looks like. Because, right? Exactly, it pulled your heart about her. I feel you. The very serious function of racism is a distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language, so you spent 20 years proving that you do. Somebody says your head isn't shaped properly, so you have scientists working on the fact that it is. Somebody says you have no art, so you dredge that up. Somebody says you have no kingdom, so you dredge that up. None of that is necessary. There will always be one more thing. And that is the problem, that this distraction of constantly having to prove our rights to exist puts us in a position where we're not able to do the work that we really meaningfully need to do. I love this so much, and I love that someone kind of put this out. You wanted to change your name when you were young. My full name is Uzoamaka. I came home one day and I said, Mommy, can you call me Zoe? Without skipping a beat, she said, if they can learn how to say Tchaikovsky, Dostoevsky, and Michelangelo, they can learn how to say this one. Right? I loved this. East Africans have European features. Well, considering East Africa is the birthplace of humanity, maybe it's Europeans that have and it is these like small moments and like in tweets and in comments that we're pulling out like massive amounts of knowledge that we're actually not able to access in a lot of the institutions that we are in. This article, necessary. Why are white people expats while the rest of us are immigrants? I'll give you one guess. And they're recognizing that racism is playing out in different places around the world, but also that anti-Blackness is present and colorism is present in all of these different spaces. But because, again, we're not often getting to talk to each other, we're only getting to see corporate media's portrayal of other parts of the world, which makes us feel like everywhere else is just light skin and there's just like maybe Black people here and on the continent, and that's it. Like we really have to challenge this idea of who belongs to a particular place, and again, really be connecting to each other, learning about each other from each other. Because this strategy of like not talking about racism is not working. And it's not working not only because we can feel it in our bodies and see it in the streets, but also because, they did a survey about it. And in the survey, they also found that people are not getting less racist. That this whole way of not having this conversation, the kind of education that we have access to, is not shifting the current situations that we are in. And I go to a university campus at least once a week. And I've been doing that for the past couple years, okay? And I would say that the one thing that comes up pretty regularly is that younger and younger folks say to me, adults never taught us how to have a difficult conversation. We don't actually know how to sit in the conversation and go to its end in something that's complicated and hard, that so often they have felt like adults have kind of placated them with wanting them to be entertained constantly, as opposed to actually teaching them how do we do this with each other, right? And again, we have to stop trying to silence these opportunities, even though they're hard and even though they're difficult, because these things are hard and difficult in their lived reality, so of course the dialogue is going to be that. I was actually at the Amber Rose Slut Walk, and he came out and he spoke after me, and I didn't know very much about him, so before he spoke, I was watching him why are you here? But then he went on, and I was like, oh, okay. You must have talked to someone black right before this, so, and I think, again, it is this sort of interruption, and I shared this because at least you guys are from Black Lives Matter, who posted this, but Black Lives Matter doesn't mean that other lives don't, other people, people who say save the rainforest aren't saying fuck all other type of forests. But again, the idea that we have to have these kinds of clapbacks is part of the way that often corporate media constructs these kinds of dialogues, right? And it really is these kinds of interruptions, especially by people who are in those media spaces, that I think are really important to breaking those things up. This campaign started at a university, but also started spreading around the internet, and I always share it just every time I have an opportunity to, because I feel like I have to start preparing everyone for Halloween now. Because the idea of dressing up as a stereotype is something that is learned from corporate media. The construction of these stereotypes, these two-dimensional ideas of personhood that are given to people, really is coming from these spaces. And it is really in the online spaces that we're seeing these things challenged, where it's not okay for you to dress up as another person. It's culture. There's so many pictures. I just strongly recommend sharing it. I tell people about this. I really, I'm having this conversation from January. It's so deep. Stop doing it. It's not cute. And hi. It looks like you quoted Martin Luther King Jr. out of context instead of engaging in the complex reality of white supremacy in America. Would you like some help with that? And this is so great. This is so great for so many different reasons. Taking this context of the Microsoft Office little helpful paperclip and doing something, because this is one of the biggest challenges I feel happens online, is the removal of things that are highly politicized from their context, and then they want to put it on a really nice background with an ocean or some trees, and then you want to hashtag it gold digger or something, it's just completely in this place where I'm y'all. And this is one of the things that we see happening, and especially Black women's knowledge, Indigenous women's knowledge, we see often getting appropriated in online context, taken out of context, and then being used against us, And I think that, again, online spaces are challenging. We're still learning them in a lot of different ways, but this is one of the things that we see happening. But again, we do see a response that is happening meaningfully and quickly. Because the challenge of depoliticizing, obviously, all of these incredibly political people is obscuring the real issues that we are fighting about, There are 832% more women in prison than in 1977. So the United States has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prison population. If prison made people safer, then the US would be really super safe, and that is actually not what's happening. And that, prisons disappear people, but they do not disappear social problems. And we recognize the people who are being disappeared into prisons. In Canada, Indigenous people make up about 2 to 5% of the total population and make up between 30 to 45% of the prison population. So this is not something that is uniquely happening in this one part of the world. There's a disproportionateness of people being locked up, and this has a lot to do with the construction of criminality and criminalization, because we know that the only place that slavery is legal is in prison. It is in the Constitution that prison is the only place where slavery is legal. And we know that so many people who are incarcerated are producing things for everyone. Producing things for Target, for Victoria's Secret. In Canada, we had all these wildfires that were happening all on the coast of BC, all being fought by prisoners. All of them. you know? And again, this construction of criminals, of terrorists, of insurgents, these kinds of languages are part of what allows the populace to justify the mass incarceration of large amounts of people. I teach yoga to a lot of different people, and I teach yoga to women who are incarcerated. And one of the women I was working with a couple of years ago, she had been in prison for 7 years for stealing formula for her child. And with no, because of being incarcerated in that system, you know, there are so many opportunities for them to continue to re-incarcerate you, right? So you can build up debt in prison. You can be in debt to the prison. So even when your sentence is served, you might still have to work for them to pay off that debt, right? We have to be really conscious that when we see the economy struggling in all of these different ways and we wonder where things are being shifted to, it is absolutely being shifted into a prison economy and a slave economy. And we have to be really conscious about the way that those things are happening. And again, this discourse around prison abolition has happened offline, obviously, in lots of different spaces, but also really deeply in online spaces. So, always important to note that there's no such thing as reverse racism. Okay? Just because when we talk about racism, people are like, but the reverse of racism would be liberation, and we want that. Okay? So, it's really important that we recognize that while women and people can be just as prejudiced, women cannot be just as sexist, Black people cannot be just as racist, because we do not hold political, economic, and institutional power. So, as a woman, I don't get to make decisions about my reproductive health. I don't. I wish I could all the time, but this is something that is made by men, constantly. As a queer person, I didn't get to decide whether I got to get married. Straight people got to decide that for me. You know? So it's really important that we recognize that we're talking about systemic power. Who has the power to make decisions? Who is enforcing these laws? Not individual feelings. Prejudice is a feeling, discrimination is an action. Anyone can engage in that. But systemic racism, systemic ableism, those kinds of things are not something that anyone can engage into. Once you say females to me, I'm not listening. I love this. And Pam is great, and I love that she let me use her face in all of these different places. You know, because I think that, things like this, you can see it's been retweeted 20,000 times, right? These sorts of experiences are not experiences that I've ever gotten to share in corporate media. I've never watched that experience in corporate media, oh my God, that's exactly how I feel. How can I tell everyone I feel this way and share that? That one of the things that gets to happen is not only do we get to learn about racism in these spaces or learn about these kinds of issues, we also get to build solidarity. We can laugh with each other. We can be there's 20,000 of us who co-sign how difficult this is and how real this is. And that has this incredible ability of making us feel less alone and less isolated. And that is so important because we are so often isolated. Love this. In terms of talking about respectability politics and kind of moving into that place, that Black History Month is often centered around Black first because it affirms assimilation, which is beneficial to the establishment. It shouldn't just be pigeonholed into being a celebration of the first Black people to enter into white spaces. You know, and that's really important because we've been doctors for, several thousand years. We're not new to this, you know? And it's really important that those things are framed in that kind of context. And it was only when I saw this and read this that I was right, you totally put into words something that I've been trying to express in 140 characters, right? The gift of something like that is incredibly valuable. And other ideas around respectability politics, for me, I think that that's one of the things that deeply plagues our movement, you know, is that so much of the imagery of tattoos, of piercings, I'm all tatted up. For me, it is really deeply related to my culture and my background. And again, so often it is considered inappropriate, but when white folks do it, it's edgy and cool, but we have purple hair and we're ghetto, and that's a negative thing. And as someone who grew up in the hood and still lives in the hood, in the Bronx, I think it is really important that we are able to challenge these sorts of ideas of respectability politics. And again, we can only do that by bringing these kinds of juxtapositions together that are often not happening in the institutional spaces that we are in. Because we know that we are punished for being ourselves constantly. Literally fired for wearing our hair the way that it grows out of our head. Indigenous communities have this experience too, being banned from practicing their culture, being sent home for speaking their own languages. You know, that these ideas of constructing respectability or what a respectable person is has so much to do with these ideas around assimilation. And suggesting, again, that the way that we access freedom is by being like everyone else. You know? And we can have these conversations about a lot of issues, but it's like whether it's the hoodie or the hijab, like what someone's wearing is not a justification for any kinds of violence that is enacted on their bodies. Like we know the people who were hung during Jim Crow were wearing suits. We know that we were pulled into slavery from our countries. Like, how much more respectable could you be being as opposed to like minding your own business, being on a whole other continent? You know? So it's really important, again, that we challenge this kind of respectability politics that suggests that we should assimilate, but then hides issues like this. I just like the term low income as a descriptor of students under the conditions of racialized capitalism. How about the term historically looted? And I think that, you know, those kinds of narratives are really important in terms of the way that we interrupt that. And I think particularly also in school and thinking about the way that classism plays out in those spaces, I think that when I was going to school, I did not have a home. When I was in high school, I left home when I was 15, and I was street involved for a very, very long time. And the assumption was that, you know, I had a home, and I had a place where I could do this homework. I had a place where my teachers would say, you know, this is just the basis of what we're teaching you, but you should go off and learn on your own. And I'm like, what? Why did you have me here for 8 hours if I don't get to learn all the things here? You know? And I think that it's really important, again, that we challenge these sorts of ideas of how learning gets to happen, because it doesn't always happen in the way that we believe it is supposed to. A couple years ago, I got invited to Gallaudet University for a workshop, and I was one of 2 hearing people in the room, and one of the activities was kind of detailing the way that hearing people have made deaf folks feel about themselves, you know? And I think that it is so important. And so I went on to do a workshop, and it was a similar sort of presentation to this, and it took 9 interpreters to come up with the signs for the language I was using, because there were no points of reference in the sign language that we were using. And for me, and you know, one of the conversations we had was like, that is such a shame that there are so many deeply important dialogues that we need to be having with each other that we're not. You know, like we're born with the ability to understand everyone. It's only over time that you learn how to not understand each other. And it is so important because so many of our deaf communities, so many of our blind communities, so many of the wheelchair users in our communities are so often excluded from these discourses and these conversations, and we have a responsibility to really be changing that. And the way that, for me, that has happened has been primarily online. The relationship that was built was one that was built online, and it was built because of me working to try to include like image descriptions or closed captioning, or working to create more access and reaching out to other deaf communities and building. And I think that deeply that's one of the things that we need to do, because we are not seeing the people who are in our communities. We're not seeing the fullness of the people in our communities, and we're not reflecting the issues that are a big part of what is happening in our communities. And we recognize that even though, you know, we have some shared experiences, that they are, again, unique in their own right, that we don't want to constantly be doing this, which is like creating a relationship to someone to prove that we're valuable of being protected, right? Civil rights are things that are supposed to be inalienable. It's not because of how much you like me. I don't need you to like me for you to believe that I deserve rights and freedom and protection. Because we know that Black women, again, are disproportionately facing an enormous amount of violence. Black women between the ages of 15 and 35 are most likely to die because of domestic violence. Meaning the people who are most likely to kill us are the people who tell us that they love us. You know, this work that is being done in the movement, again, is again being eclipsed, but this is sort of what is happening. And our bodies are being policed in an enormous way. So she got dress coded for her shirt because it shows like her clavicle. I don't know, I was like, the clavicle. All right. And then on the other end, this teen, her skirt was said that it was too long, and it was seen as a provocation against secularism. So the idea is like we're wearing not enough clothes, and then too many clothes, and not the right kind of clothes. And so much of this is about like autonomy over our own bodies. Like, we can show up as sex workers, we can show up in a full hijab, we can show up and be in the movement and be present and be active. But again, because these things happen so much in public spaces, this is why I see so many more women and women of color organizing online. Because we don't have to deal with that kind of experience, because people are actually more willing to maybe listen to what we're saying, as opposed to policing our bodies in these ways. When you interrupt a girl's school day to force her to change clothes or send her home because her shorts are too short, you're telling her that making sure boys have a distraction-free learning environment is more important than her education. And this is what is happening. And this is part of why we don't see the same kind of visibility of certain people that we're beginning to see online. I'm going to skip that because we have like 5 minutes. And that we know that without Black women, especially Black queer women, there'd be no movement at Mizzou. There'd be no Black Lives Matter. There would be so many of the movements that are so integral to all of the work that is being happening right now is deeply, deeply rooted in the work of Black queer women. And at the same time, these women are being invisibilized and their work is not being valued in the same kind of capacity. Similarly, we know this about trans folks. Transgender African Americans actively participated in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Civil rights movements that did not at all advance their own civil rights, right? The communities are literally buying into and supporting other movements while at the same time being patently denied access. This happened with Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin, who was actually supposed to give the I Have a Dream speech, and the reason why he didn't was because he was found a couple weeks later having sex with his partner in his car, and as a result of that, they were like, we don't want to make the movement about gay things. And you're like, but it is about gay things. It's about gay things and trans things and queer things and Black things, and none of those things are mutually exclusive from our humanity. That we actually know that there are more than 2 sexualities and more than 2 genders. That sexual and gender diversity is the norm. Whether we think about the hijra or the mouche or the katui, like literally on every single continent, there are multiple ways of talking and thinking about gender. But again, because of the way that we access information, we're not getting to see this. But online, we are getting to see this. We are getting to have these kinds of conversations. All right, that's going to the end of it. So, definitely here I talk a lot about gender, and it's dope, and you should look at it. But I want to kind of get to some of the imaginings for the future. I know it's so great. It was a really beautiful present, y'all. Transforming small and large ecosystems. I watch people go through great strides to avoid looking critically at themselves, to avoid saying, I was wrong, I'm sorry. I've seen people throw away love to avoid facing their insecurities and fears. If you love me and you see me doing that, please grab me, hold me tight, remind me that I am great and I deserve opportunities to grow and ascend, even if they hurt, even if I am ashamed. Yes. Yes. We are crueler than we think we are. Giving people apologies does not take away things from you. Acknowledging the ways in which we need to be better at treating other people the way that they want to be treated. Not assuming that we are the standards for other people's experiences, but actually asking and learning what it means for people to feel safe or full or present in community. And it is also about starting where you are and using what you have and doing what you can. I say this all the time, the grass is greener where you water it. Whether that is in your online spaces or in your physical spaces, the places that we invest into are the places that absolutely experience the greatest kind of growth. And I think it's also about shifting the ways that we talk to each other about this. That so often we're just asking each other, like, what's your hustle? And I get that. But I also want to ask you, what problems do you want to solve? What kind of person do you want to be? What does integrity look like for you? You know, that we can shape and reshape the ways that we have these conversations in our communities so that we're having a different kind of conversation, because the people who are privileged are also the ones who are the most hopeless. They are the least likely to come up with the solutions because they are the most easy to decide that there is no hope. The point is that the alternative and the hope is going to come from the people who've always been pushed to the margins, because those are the people who've already figured out how to live without the system supporting them. And it is really deeply important that in the work that we do, we continue to center those margins and bring them to the places where they actively deserve. So for me, the things I think are deeply important are around organizing and creating spaces to do that online. I love this. I thought it was super dope. Fabiana Rodriguez talks about this, and I think there's so many really great images of what that means, that our communities need to be secure, and we are the ones, the best ones, to do that. Challenging stigma. I don't know if anyone saw this campaign, beautiful campaign redone for Mother's Day, and for people who have mothers who might be incarcerated, for people who have mothers who might be disabled, for people who have mothers who, you know, you can't go to the card store and be like, I need a card for my mom who is serving 25. You know, and like those people deserve community, deserve family, deserve spaces. Challenging stigma. Cardi B lives in the Bronx, we go to the same nail salon. Same girl, Jenny. And I think one of the things, we would not see the visibility of someone like this if it wasn't for online and social media spaces. We would not see the visibility of people who have no attention to respectability politics, you know, and it is so important because, again, bringing up real issues that are facing people on the ground and at the same time changing the way that we talk about relationships. I think one of the ways this happens online, that's hella dope. I love when people do this. Show those double standards, illustrate them as often as possible. If you can't share it from your own timeline, you can create private pages and share it from them. You don't have to, if you're not in a place where you can disclose who you are online, it might not be a safe space, there are lots of opportunities to do important work like that online. Even putting together images like this that challenge the ideas of what people think are beautiful or valuable, like this is math, y'all. Like that's the limit. That's fractals. Like that's deep. You know? And challenging the way, I love this. I was like, congratulations, you played yourself, because this happens all the time. I see you. Create culture and produce media. From an article called The Fat Boy Selfies, amazing, so important. I live in a world where either body privilege or race privilege is always against me. So I point my camera at my face most often when I'm alone and possibly bored, and I click. I upload it to Instagram and I hold my breath because the world is cruel and I'm what some would call ugly, but I don't see it. I love Instagram. I'm that girl on your Instagram page 52 weeks back, loving every single stuff you ever did. Women of color on YouTube who are also interrupting that, but this is not new. Frederick Douglass was the most photographed man of the 19th century, and the reason why he did that was because he believed that photographs were a powerful means of moral and social influence, allowing the poor and oppressed to find self-confidence. The humblest servant girl may now possess a picture of herself such as the wealth of kings could not purchase 50 years ago. He recognized that the importance of us having lots of pictures of ourselves is valuable for changing that discourse. The idea that it's narcissistic to want to look at ourselves as opposed to like the same 4 white women that we've been looking at for the past 25 years is ridiculous. We have to want to see more different people, and the ways that we do that is also by taking pictures of ourselves, because it's really not happening in these spaces. I'm just going to say 8% of movies had a protagonist of color, and of the 8, 6 were Will Smith. And one of them was a cartoon, and it was Aladdin, okay? That even in sci-fi, you don't see it. So you could imagine, like, witches and unicorns, but you can't imagine black people? Like, Harry Potter could be a Tibetan trans guy in a wheelchair. Like, we have to be able to go to places that are substantially more boundless. And again, I see those things happening in online spaces. This is a show that I produced a couple of years ago that, again, people always tell me that these sort of shows, Alexis Pauline Guns had her artwork at this show. It was in the audience. It was hella dope. And we brought together so many different artists who were indigenous, artists who were deaf, artists who were queer, to all create work together. This happened in physical space and in online spaces. You know, that we can do things that are beautiful and accessible. Like, we had interpreters, we had people who were there just in case people were triggered. Like, we take care of people, and it's possible to do that in the art and the culture and the media that we are producing and that we are making with each other. Increasing accessibility, we don't know what disability looks like. You know, the next time you shade someone for deciding to take the stairs, like, you don't know what their life is like, you have no idea what's going on in their bodies. It's really important that we think about what accessibility looks like in space, whether that means that you're providing childcare, or food, or it's free, or it's in an accessible space. Like, we want to think about those things because we have to make space for each other to be able to show up. Accessibility is also about making sure things are in culturally relevant ways. Oh, y'all dab on them? Why are we so genius? Like, the acronym of this and making sure that it's kind of a language that's accessible to young people and relevant to young people, that inspires them to get excited about learning. Like, why do we feel like learning has to be boring? Like, why does it have to make people, why can't we work in the culture that they are being created? We can meet each other at those spaces. Because no one needs to read dense books or articles to learn about their lives and understand their oppression. Because online happens, and it is an amazing way that happens. Sharing resources. When governments were like, we can't keep any people, we won't take refugees, individual people were like, yes, we will. This Airbnb for refugees that got set up was really, really successful as like a first line for so many people in the beginning. I'm one of the owners of the Glad Day Bookshop. We're the oldest LGBT bookstore in the world. We also share these resources and our books online really, really accessibly. And in our store, we host a lot of opportunities for people to come and learn and play and build community and access art. And I think that those things are so valuable because, again, it's the way that we share resources and share learning that completely catalyzes our ability to create solid networks of support in our community. These are some dope examples of online spaces that you can see online, but also access in person. I'm not going to go through all of them. Starting young. If you're a good teacher, your students will always surpass you, and that's the goal. I hope at the end of my life I can just say that I've used all of my talents in service to my community. Like, I need to download everything that I have had access to into the people around me. That's what I do on my Facebook page. Anyone who follows me, you know that I share what I learn. I made that commitment to people 5 years ago, and as a result of the privilege I get of being able to be in spaces like this, I will constantly pay it forward and give people for free the things I get to access, because the more and more this information is accessible, the better the quality of our lives will be. Because we know that younger and younger, rest in peace, Blake Brockington, that our younger and younger kids are being impacted by these things. We cannot pretend that this is a conversation you can start when you feel like someone is old enough, because we know that, has anyone seen the documentary A Girl Like Me? Look up A Girl Like Me. Yeah, look up A Girl Like Me and check that out and see that. The Radical Monarchs, do y'all know about them? They so lit, I can't even deal. You know, people being like, young people can't do anything, and 8-year-olds being like, yes we can. Amazing group, like girl guys, but like turn up, you know? Amazing group of social justice young people who are really engaged in doing that work down in Oakland. Coalition and collective building. This was from New York. Recently, a coalition came together of women who are nail artists to try to create more safety in those spaces. That so often we think about this in like purely academic context, but it's really important that we recognize that people across all jobs, across all experiences need that support. Not everyone is going to go to university. Some people are just going to do amazing acrylics, and that is beautiful and valuable, and we need to protect them when they do that. This is just, I thought it was a beautiful, beautiful illustration, the incredible work that is being done by Black Lives Matter. If you don't know who they are, please take the names in, take a screenshot. It's all up here. You can take a look at that. By Felipe, or like feminist Tinder, places like that online that have become spaces for like women who are being harassed online to share their experiences and get support, and also be able to put people on blast who are creating online spaces that are really violent. These kinds of things are really, really dope. Holla Back Girl is another one of those where you get to take pictures of street harassers and post them. Like ways in which online spaces are being used to create more safety in offline spaces, I think is an incredibly radical thing that is happening. Because again, we have a long history of this kind of solidarity, and now it's playing out online, and I think there's a lot of incredible possibilities. The Los Angeles Femme of Color Collective created a hashtag, Femmes of Color Visibility, that now allows for archiving to happen. Like, hashtags are archives. I love it. It's so exciting to me to be able to go back and look at a wealth of knowledge all around a particular issue that are so specific and nuanced. Solidarity. This is a friend of mine. He did this actually when he was in Bermuda, and it says, I don't know what my son's sexual orientation is going to be, and because I don't know, I'm about the business of creating a world where he can express himself in ways that are healthy and ways that he is safe to be who he wants to be. And for me, solidarity looks like this. It looks like actions where we're willing to put ourselves at risk, we're willing to leverage our own privilege, whatever that is, and his own privilege as being a non-queer person, to make more space for people who don't have that same privilege, who don't have that same kind of access. These are a list of like my solid strategies for solidarity. I always include them, and again, I'm not going to go through them because 5 minutes was like 10 minutes ago. But I do want to say, again, I mentioned this before, I think one of the most important things is to treat other people the way they want to be treated. You know, so often we're told to treat other people the way that we want to be treated, which assumes that you're the standard for other people's reality, and you're not. We have to ask, we have to be engaged in that conversation, and we have to be allowing people to shape their own communities in the ways that they envision for themselves. And I think also for me, something that's really important is to say that guilt isn't useful, solidarity is, leverage your privilege. It doesn't, like, guilt is a privilege. For you to feel guilty about this, like, I don't actually have time for that. But I do have time and space for your solidarity. Every time you recognize that there's a space that you are accessing privilege, that's another opportunity for you to go hard for each other, right? It shouldn't be this like, oh my gosh, I'm so sad, what am I gonna do? I'm such an awful person. Like, bye. Pay attention to the fact that there are communities of people who have been needing your support and your solidarity, and think about how you can offer yourself in service to them. Not coming up with a great idea that you want to implement all on your own, but actually coming to those communities and saying, I'm here. Tell me what you want me to do. I think that some of those are really, really tangible ways that we can think about what solidarity looks like. And then maybe the last would be to collect your folks. Collecting people with shared experiences of privilege, like my husband, he's the one, whenever someone is doing too much on my timeline and it's hella sexist, I just tag him right in. I'm just like, I'm not even doing this. You need to talk to this person. And it is really important that you think about what your allyship can look like, especially online for people. Block at will when people are doing too much. I have a block party like once a week. Like, if you've seen my block list, it's really, really deep. But for the people who need to have those conversations and you want to be able to go deep, it's really important that, again, we collect our folks, reaching out to those people who have those shared experiences because we understand it. The more and more you reflect on your own privilege and your own bigotry, the more it gives you insight into others' bigotry. And that allows you to be a better ally and better able to act in solidarity with other people. Okay, this is cheesy a little bit, but it's really true. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. You know, and I think that when I first started doing this work, everyone in my life was like, oh, Kim, you're such a killjoy. Like, everything you're talking about is so much. And I'm like, this is my life and this is my experience. And I can't not do this. I can't not follow this to where it leads. I cannot. And I think that the more and more that I followed that with deep, deep passion, the more I moved people out of my lives who couldn't sustain that, and the more that there was more space for people in my lives who could. People who shared and were allied in terms of values and experiences, and that allowed me to amplify that work. I strongly recommend you to really be conscious of your gut and conscious of your intuition, these intangible things that really keep us in line as to what other people's experiences of suffering are. You know, our empathy is deeply necessary, and our ability to feel other people's suffering is deeply necessary for us to be able to shift that, whether that is happening in online spaces or in offline spaces. There's the links to all of the places you can find me, but again, because I work with young people, I'm on everything. Like, I'm on Snapchat, and I'm on Periscope, and I'm on Twitter, and I'm on Instagram. So feel free to reach out to me on any one of those platforms and totally to check out the prezzies. Thanks, y'all.
Yeah.